Hi, let's have a look at Book 12 and do our summary of the key parts of Book 12. You'll see a nice warlike picture there to launch us at the start. So, key events of Book 12. We've got to the climax of the story, and in order to resolve the war, Turnus and Aeneas have agreed that it's pointless carrying on fighting. They can't get a clear winner, and therefore they're going to have a single combat. Unfortunately for that solution, Juno is worried that Aeneas is actually going to be stronger, and so she sends Turnus' sister Juturna to go to his aid. And Juturna disguises herself, goes into the Latin camp, stirs up war again, and fighting breaks out. Aeneas is wounded by a random arrow that's fired from the Latin side, and he has to leave the battle. And he's going to be healed with the help of Venus, who sends some special flowers and potion to heal him. But while he's away, Turnus thinks this is his big chance to win the war. And so the fighting has gone on. Aeneas returns. He attacks the city of Latium. And then Turnus suddenly realizes that actually the city is suffering tragically and terribly, and realizes that he needs to stop the fighting in order to spare the city. This then allows the duel to start, and Juno is persuaded to stop prolonging the fighting by the other gods. She agrees to do this as long as the Latins can keep their language and their customs, and she recognizes that it's actually pointless going on fighting. So she then withdraws from helping Turnus. And the result of that is that Aeneas then overpowers Turnus, has him at his mercy, starts to think he's going to give mercy to Turnus, but then sees Turnus wearing Pallas's belt. And so as the poem ends, we get this surge of furor that overwhelms Aeneas and leads him to kill Turnus. And the poem finishes at this very strange kind of moment. At the death of Turnus, there's no resolution, and we're left to try and work out what that means for ourselves, which, of course, is one of the big questions about Book 12. So there's our key events, which leads us into the end of the poem. In terms of the Roman context, there's a rather obvious flaw in Virgil creating a national myth. Now, as we've covered before, what Virgil's trying to do in writing the Aeneid is creating this backstory for the Romans to help them understand what their origins were. And there's a major issue with that. If the Romans are descended from the Trojans, how come they speak Latin? Why is it that they don't show any of the signs of these Trojan people? So actually, we've got this convenient, or you might say contrived, agreement between Juno and the Council of the Gods, which says the Latin language and customs must continue. So that helps us to explain for us, the Roman audience, why they are Latin and why they speak Latin, etc. I think there's another question as well that's in Book 12. How far are we meant to be taking Aeneas to be the Augustus figure and Turnus the Mark Antony figure? And scholars have argued about this. It's not entirely clear whether Virgil wants us to see Aeneas as being Augustus. There are problems with that, of course, aren't there, because of the way Aeneas behaves towards the end. And it does raise this question about the killing of Turnus. Is it justified? And when you look at Aeneas's emotions as we get to the end of Book 12, he starts by cooling off in line 941. And he begins to then think about mercy, which is very interesting, isn't it? Because as Virgil wrote, rolling his eyes, he checked his hand, hesitating more and more as the words of Turnus began to move him. So there's a moment where Aeneas's emotion and his furor has been calmed and he can come back to himself. But the belt, the baldric of Pallas, is the thing that actually sets him off again into a mad passion, blazing with rage, the reminder of wild grief. We get this real sense that Aeneas is out of control at the end. And there's a question about what's happening with Augustus and with the Romans. Is this part of war? Or is it a warning to Augustus of what happens when you've got power? Or is it a warning to the Romans about what might happen once Augustus has got that power, what's going to be the future? So there are questions raised at the end of Book 12, which are very interesting for Roman context and something to explore. Characterization-wise, I think it'd be very interesting to have a look at Turnus here and compare him to Aeneas. We know that from the earlier part of the story, Cupid has brought about the love, the amour for Dido, and that's led to her destruction. The visitor, the Fury Electo, has triggered anger in Turnus and developed his furor. And in Book 12, we see that. Turnus was distraught with love, burning all the more for war. He spoke, "His blood or mine shall decide this war." There he is in line 80, expressing this desire for destruction. And yet, as we get into the latter part of Book 12, Turnus suddenly comes to his senses. I think it's fascinating that as he hears of the terrible suffering in Latium that he's been causing, he has this experience of kind of collecting himself. It's very interesting, the whole passage. Turnus was thunderstruck, bewildered by the changing shape of his fortune, and stood there dumb and staring. Remind you of anybody? Remind you of anybody in Book 4? Remind you of anybody meeting Mercury in Book 4? Suddenly waking up out of the sort of the sentence of amour is how Aeneas comes out in Book 4. And here's Turnus waking up out of furor. In that one heart of his there seized a bitter shame, a grief shot through with madness, love driven on by fury, and a consciousness of his own courage. And I think there's a very, very interesting telling line straight after that quote. As soon as the shadows lifted from his mind and light returned, he forced his burning eyes round towards the walls, looking back in deep dismay. Turnus suddenly realizes that what he's been doing has led to the destruction of his people. And so then he says, I'm going to actually sort this. I'm going to go to one-to-one battle. It's madness, but before I die, I beg of you, let me be mad. He accepts that it's going to need to be his death that brings peace. I think is quite striking about what we might therefore conclude about Turnus here. And as we get to the point where he's been defeated by Aeneas, he's lying there helpless in front of Aeneas. What's the thing he says? I have brought this upon myself. He doesn't blame the gods. He doesn't blame Aeneas. He doesn't blame anybody. He says, I've brought this upon myself. What a fascinating conclusion to the character of Turnus. And it raises for you a question about whether Turnus, as the antagonist, has brought greater levels of honour and a greater sense of balance to his behaviour than maybe Aeneas ends up with. Very, very interesting. We're not going to just go through this, but if you look at the words that are used by Virgil to describe the two heroes, look at the ones about Turnus, furor, Alatus, Ardennes. He's bold, he's violent, he's wild. And then you look at Aeneas. He's also bold, but he's devoted to his duty, pietas. But he mixes between anger and frenzy, whereas Turnus is seemingly wildly out of control. And yet, at the end of the book, where are we left with those two characters? Who's the one who has come to his senses? Who's the one who's out of control? There's a question for you. And then finally, Virgil's style or narrative techniques, similes. Let's remember why similes are useful. They're dramatic, they're colourful, they bring the story to life, they're memorable. In addition, they're very appropriate to their audience. They're pitched to the people who are listening or reading. And for Virgil, there's a sort of Homeric resonance as well. The Homeric extended simile was a very strong part of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Book 12 seems to be the place that Virgil suddenly thinks, oh no, I was meant to be Homeric and I've forgotten all about it. And he stuffs in 19 similes to the 952 lines of Book 12. It's groaning with similes all the way through. And what I just wanted to pick up was the thing to remember about when you're analysing a simile. And you're asked how effectively, how vividly, how creatively does Virgil do this, that, or the other. Remember the key thing to do if you're analysing. Firstly, choose your little bit of text, the like or as part in this case. identify what feeling or emotion or idea it's conveying, and then explain how that's done effectively by Virgil. If we took an example from Book 12, and I just dropped in on line 739, 740. Turnus has taken the sword that he believes to be given to him by the gods. It's an indestructible sword, but he's picked up the wrong one. He's actually got a mortal sword, and he goes to go and attack Aeneas, who of course has the armor that's been given to him by Venus, that was made by Vulcan. And what happens when Turnus attacks Aeneas? When the sword, met the divine armor made by Vulcan, the mortal blade was brittle as an icicle. So here's my little bit, like an icicle, as an icicle. There's my text. Identify the feeling, emotion, idea. So it's giving us the idea that this is actually a mortal blade that's actually brittle. So I'm going to say the sword wasn't the one he was expecting. So when he uses it, line 740, shattered on impact. So it's like an icicle that breaks on impact. How's that been done effectively by Virgil? Why is that an effective way of describing the moment of the sword striking the shield? And all that Virgil says is, leaving its fragments glittering on the golden sand. Now, who amongst us has not ever taken a bit of ice and just given into that temptation to chuck it down onto the ground and watch the pieces shatter and splinter all over the floor? How is this an effective image? Virgil wants us to get a sense that Turnus thinks he's going to be successful, and then he's broken and despairing when his sword is destroyed. And so that icicle that looks so firm and strong when you throw it on the ground is destroyed into zillions of pieces. And therefore Virgil has used a very simple, everyday image to capture the spirit of Turnus's despair and the destruction of the sword. So there's a kind of good example about how we might take a simile and play with it to explain the effectiveness. So there's our book 12, and hopefully that has been helpful in giving you your summary.